My daughter sent me a list of 30 rules I had to follow before she would let me come to her wedding. I booked a one-way flight to Maui on her wedding day and left her a letter. An hour after the ceremony should have started, she would not stop calling. I looked at my phone and saw 85 missed calls. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Leo Campbell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent my entire life working with my hands. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the late autumn sun was casting long shadows across my driveway. I was lying underneath my 2012 Chevy Silverado with grease under my fingernails and the familiar smell of motor oil comforting me. To anyone driving by, I looked exactly like what they expected to see. A tired, retired blue-collar mechanic living out his golden years in a modest suburban home, trying to keep an old truck running. That was the facade I had carefully maintained for the last 5 years. I never felt the need to tell anyone, especially not the neighbors, that 5 years ago I sold the heavy machinery company I built from nothing for $18 million. My late wife Diane and I started that company with one rusty bulldozer and a dream. When she passed away, the money meant nothing to me without her here to share it. I kept the old house, I kept the old truck, and I kept my mouth shut. True wealth does not need to shout. And I was observing very closely when a pristine white leased luxury sedan pulled into my driveway, interrupting my peace. Out stepped my 28-year-old daughter Natalie, followed by her fiancé Blake Evans. Blake was the kind of man who wore suits that were a little too tight and spoke a little too loudly about his supposed success. I slid out from under the truck, wiping my stained hands on a shop rag. Natalie looked at my grease-stained shirt and visibly cringed, taking a half step back as if hard work was somehow contagious. She did not hug me. She just offered a tight, strained smile. Blake looked down at me from his perceived pedestal. "Still playing mechanic at your age, Leo?" he asked with a chuckle that lacked any real warmth. "You know there are places you can take that old thing, so you do not have to break your back on the concrete." A quiet, polite smile. I did not tell him that I could buy the dealership that leased him his car with the interest I made last month alone. I just nodded and said, "Old habits die hard, Blake." They did not come to see how I was doing. They came to deliver an ambush. Natalie nervously adjusted the strap of her designer purse. "Dad, we need you to come to dinner tonight," she said, her voice carrying that specific tone of instruction rather than invitation. "Blake's parents are flying in for the wedding preparations, and they want an introductory dinner. We are going to the most exclusive steakhouse downtown. Please wear something nice. Do not embarrass us." I looked at the daughter I had raised, the girl who used to sit on my lap and pretend to drive my tractor. She was consumed by the illusion of status Blake had wrapped her in. I agreed to go because she was my only child and I loved her. But I had a sinking feeling in my chest that this dinner was not going to be a celebration of two families coming together. That evening, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the steakhouse. The air smelled of aged beef and expensive wine. I wore my best suit, a classic tailored piece that was impeccably clean but intentionally understated. When I reached the table, Blake and Natalie were already seated next to Blake's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Evans were dripping in labels. The mother wore a cocktail dress that tried too hard and jewelry that caught the light in a way that screamed for attention. The father wore a flashy, oversized watch that he made sure to keep visible at all times. From the moment the appetizers arrived, the Evans family launched into a relentless monologue about their country club memberships, their luxury vacations, and the exclusive social circles they claimed to dominate. They spoke to me with slow, exaggerated enunciation, as if poverty also affected a person's hearing. Mr. Evans leaned forward, swirling a glass of wine that cost more than my first car. "Blake tells us you are enjoying a quiet retirement, Leo," he said with a patronizing grin. "It must be tough managing on a fixed income these days with the economy the way it is. If you ever need advice on how to stretch those pension checks, my door is always open." Thank you, I said, my voice level. I managed just fine. But my eyes were doing the real talking. After 40 years of dealing with corporate sharks and fraudulent contractors, I knew how to spot a fake. I noticed Mr. Evans' watch was a high-quality replica. I noticed the worn heels of his shoes. I noticed the way his eyes darted nervously when the waiter recited the market price of the lobster. They were drowning. I could smell the suffocating scent of credit card debt and leveraged assets radiating off them. They were performing wealth, not living it. When the astronomical bill finally arrived, the table went awkwardly silent. Mr. Evans reached for the leather folder with a dramatic sigh, opening his wallet to reveal a thick stack of platinum cards. No, Leo, please do not even reach for your wallet, he announced, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. We insist. We know you are on a strict budget, and we would hate for you to worry about this. Let us take care of you. Natalie looked at me, her face flushed with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Blake puffed out his chest, looking at his father with immense pride. That is very generous of you, I replied softly. Thank you for the meal. I let them pay the bill with what I strongly suspected was a nearly maxed-out credit card. I walked out of that restaurant, allowing them to believe they had successfully asserted their dominance over a helpless, broke old man. I played the part because I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I found out exactly how far the very next morning. I woke up at dawn as I have done every day of my adult life. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Diane and I used to balance our checkbook by hand when we barely had a dime to our names. I opened my laptop to check my emails. Sitting right at the top of my inbox was a message from Natalie, with Blake copied on the thread. The subject line read, "Wedding Expectations." Attached was a 3-page PDF document. I took a sip of my coffee, my heart already preparing itself for disappointment. It was a numbered list of 30 rules. 30 specific humiliating conditions I was required to agree to if I wanted to attend my own daughter's wedding. I read through the list, and with every line I felt the image of the daughter I loved fracture a little more. Rule number 4. You will park your truck in the vendor lot behind the venue, so it is not visible to the arriving guests. Rule number 12. Under no circumstances are you to discuss your past work history or your current living situation with any of Blake's family members or our friends, and do not ask the Evans family or venue staff for handouts or special treatment. Rule number 18. You will wear the pre-approved rented suit that Blake has selected for you. Do not wear any of your own clothes. I scrolled down the screen. Rule number 29. You will not sit at the head family table. We have arranged a seat for you at table 14 near the kitchen doors, so you can easily step out if you feel overwhelmed. My breath caught in my throat. Table 14. Near the kitchen doors. Hidden away like a dirty secret. They wanted me there to fulfill the biological requirement of a father giving away the bride, but they wanted me invisible. They wanted me erased from the narrative of their fake high society life. And then I read the final line. Rule number 30. If you cannot abide by every rule on this list without complaint, do not attend the wedding. Blake and I have worked too hard on our image to have it compromised. We expect your written agreement by the end of the week. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, the silence pressing against my ears. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not call Natalie to demand an explanation or cry about the disrespect. I am a man who built an empire from the dirt up. When a foundation is rotten, you do not try to paint over it. You demolish it. I printed the list of 30 rules. The printer hummed and whirred, churning out the physical evidence of my daughter's betrayal. I picked up the warm pages and set them next to a framed photograph of Diane. I looked at my beautiful wife's smiling face. I am sorry, Diane, I whispered to the empty room. But I cannot let them treat me like this. I will not be a prop in their delusion. I reached for my phone and made a single call. I did not call my daughter. I called Owen Foster, my wealth manager. Owen is a sharp, resourceful man who handles my $18 million portfolio with total discretion. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed a quiet, lawful background investigation into Blake Evans and his parents. I wanted public filings, property records, liens collection cases, business disclosures, and any financial information his investigators could legally obtain. I wanted to know what their lifestyle actually rested on, not what they claimed at dinner. Then I asked him to determine exactly who controlled the wedding venue. Owen did not ask questions. He knew me well enough to know that when I spoke with that specific tone, a storm was coming. "Consider it done, Leo," he replied. "Is there anything else?" I looked down at the printed list of rules resting on the oak table. "Yes," I said. "I need you to find out exactly who owns the venue where my daughter is getting married. And Owen, I need you to prepare some travel arrangements for me. I am going to be taking a trip very soon." I hung up the phone and took a final sip of my black coffee. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway. I looked back at the email on my screen. Rule number 30. If you cannot abide by every rule on this list, do not attend. For the first time since reading the email, a genuine smile crossed my face. I was not going to fight them. I was not going to beg for a seat at the head table or ask for permission to park in the main lot. I was going to follow my daughter's rules to the letter. I was going to abide by Rule 30. And in doing so, I was going to let their entire house of cards collapse exactly when they least expected it. The silent adjustment had begun. The bell above the door of the Silver Star Diner chimed, cutting through the low hum of the morning rush. I sat in a faded red vinyl booth near the back, nursing a mug of bitter black coffee. Outside, a light drizzle washed over the streets of the city, blurring the headlights of passing cars. I always liked this diner. The floors were scuffed from decades of working boots, and the waitress knew my name. It was the exact opposite of the steakhouse, where the Evans family had tried to humiliate me just a few nights prior. I watched the front door until I saw Owen Foster step out of the rain. Owen was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the diner itself, but he moved with a quiet respect that did not demand attention. He spotted me and walked over, sliding into the booth across the table. He just reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder, setting it gently on the sticky Formica table. "It is remarkably thin, Leo," Owen said. His voice kept low, so the neighboring tables could not hear. I looked at the folder but did not touch it yet. I expected a thicker file, I admitted. When a family talks as much as they do, you expect a mountain of paperwork to back it up. Owen offered a small, tight smile. "That is the thing about fake wealth, Leo. It does not leave a paper trail of assets. It only leaves a trail of liabilities. Open it." I flipped open the cover. The very first page was a financial summary that made my stomach turn cold. It was a portrait of a sinking ship. The Evans family was drowning in roughly $400,000 of high-interest consumer debt. I read the numbers slowly, letting the reality of their situation sink in. They had second mortgages on a house they barely owned. They had maxed-out lines of credit spread across a dozen different banks. Those luxury cars they flaunted at the restaurant were leased on terrible terms with payments they were consistently late on making. "They are floating on plastic," Owen explained, leaning forward. "They shuffle money from one credit card to pay the minimum balance on another. It is a classic shell game. One missed payment or one unexpected expense and their entire lifestyle collapses into bankruptcy." I turned the page, feeling a heavy sadness mixed with my growing anger. I found the section dedicated to Blake, my future son-in-law. Natalie had proudly told me that Blake was a vice president of acquisitions at a rising tech startup. It was the title he used to justify looking down on me for having grease on my hands. I looked at the employment verification documents Owen had pulled. "The title is fabricated," Owen said, anticipating my question. "The startup he works for is bleeding venture capital and facing severe payroll shortages. Blake is essentially a mid-level sales representative who gave himself a fancy title on his email signature. He has no equity in the company. He receives no bonuses. His base salary barely covers the rent on the luxury apartment he shares with your daughter. My mind drifted back to a hot summer day nearly 40 years ago. I remembered the heavy smell of diesel, fuel, and wet dirt. I remembered my late wife, Diane, standing next to me wearing worn-out denim overalls with mud smudged across her cheek. We had just emptied our entire meager savings account to buy a single used yellow bulldozer. It was rusted and the engine sounded rough, but it was ours. We did not lease it to look rich. We bought it to build something real. We spent years eating cheap sandwiches and waking up before the sun, working until our hands were blistered and our backs ached. Every dollar we made went back into the business. We built our heavy machinery empire brick by brick, contract by contract. We knew the value of a dollar because we had traded our sweat for every one of them. Blake and his parents knew nothing about real work. They only knew how to consume. They treated money as a theatrical prop used to construct an illusion of superiority. But the illusion was cracking, and now I understood exactly why they were so desperate to maintain control over Natalie. I looked back at Owen. My voice was dangerously calm. He does not love her, does he? Owen looked at me with genuine sympathy. I cannot speak to his emotions, Leo. But looking at these financial records, I can tell you that Natalie is the only solvent person in that relationship. She has no debt. She has excellent credit. And more importantly, Blake knows she has a father who he believes will always bail her out. Natalie was not just marrying a snob. She was marrying a parasite. Blake and his family viewed my daughter as a life raft. They needed her pristine credit score and her steady income to keep their fraudulent lifestyle afloat. And beyond that, they probably looked at my quiet suburban life and assumed I had a cozy retirement fund they could slowly drain over the years. They treated me like garbage to establish dominance, hoping to shame me into submission so I would quietly write checks to keep the peace. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a foolish old mechanic who would blindly follow their 30 humiliating rules just to be allowed into the room. They had no idea that the man they were insulting was the very person who could crush their entire existence with a single phone call. I tapped my fingers on the manila folder. A protective rage began to settle over my heart. It was the cold, precise calculation of a father who realizes he has to let his daughter learn the hardest lesson of her life in order to save her from a lifetime of exploitation. If I tried to show this folder to Natalie, now she would not believe me. She was too deeply under Blake's spell. She would accuse me of trying to ruin her happiness out of spite. She had to see the illusion shatter with her own 2 eyes. Owen finished his water and waited for my instructions. "What is the next step, Leo?" he asked softly. I pushed the folder back toward him. "You keep this for now," I said. "I want you to look into the venue they booked for the wedding. The Grand Pinnacle Estate. Natalie mentioned they still have a final payment due on the day of the ceremony. I want to know exactly how Blake plans to pay for it, considering he does not have a dime to his name." Owen nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he caught on to my line of thinking. "I will find out who manages their accounts and see what strings are being pulled." I slid out of the vinyl booth, leaving a $20 bill on the table for the waitress. I looked at Owen one last time. "Do not interfere with anything they are doing, Owen. Let them keep spending money they do not have. Let them keep making promises they cannot keep. We are going to let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly can." I walked out of the diner and back into the cold rain. I climbed into the cab of my old Chevy Silverado and gripped the steering wheel. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. My daughter had sent me 30 rules designed to humiliate me and push me into the shadows. But Blake and his parents had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the man in the shadows is the only one who can see everything clearly. I put the truck in gear and drove away, knowing exactly what I had to do next. It was time to set the trap. 2 days passed since my meeting with Owen in the rain-slicked diner. I spent my afternoon in the garage meticulously restoring a salvaged wooden workbench. The rhythmic sanding of the grain was a kind of meditation for me. It kept my hands busy and my mind from dwelling too heavily on the list of 30 humiliating rules my daughter had sent me. The scent of sawdust and old varnish filled the air, providing a small comfort against the weight of her betrayal. My phone buzzed loudly against the metal tool cart, cutting through the quiet hum of the afternoon. I wiped the sawdust from my hands with an old shop rag and answered. It was Owen. He spoke with the sharp, rapid cadence of a man who had just uncovered something valuable and highly volatile. "Leo," he said, his voice projecting clearly over the speaker. "I dug into the financial arrangements for the wedding at the Grand Pinnacle Estate, exactly as you asked. What I found is going to interest you greatly." I leaned against the heavy oak frame of the workbench and told him to go ahead. Owen explained that the Grand Pinnacle Estate was one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the region. It was exactly the kind of fairy tale backdrop Natalie had always dreamed of, and exactly the kind of status symbol the Evans family desperately needed to maintain their illusion of wealth. But exclusivity came with a steep price tag. Owen detailed that the venue operated on a very specific billing model for their high-prestige events. They required a modest deposit to secure the date, but the bulk of the expense was structured as a balloon payment due on the very morning of the wedding. For Natalie and Blake, that final payment was exactly $80,000. The payment was scheduled to be processed at 10 in the morning on the day of the ceremony, right before the caterers set up the tables and before the florists unpacked a single rose. I asked Owen how Blake intended to cover an $80,000 invoice when we already knew his family was drowning in $400,000 of consumer debt. Owen let out a low, humorless breath. "That is the magic of their delusion, Leo. Blake has a dozen different credit cards. He plans to stand at the manager's desk on the morning of the wedding and swipe them one by one, maxing out whatever temporary credit limits he can beg out of the banks. And if that fails, his backup plan is undeniably to panic and pressure Natalie into draining her own modest savings to save her perfect day." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My daughter was walking blindly into the financial slaughterhouse. Blake and his parents were not just pretending to be rich. They were actively weaponizing Natalie's desire for a beautiful wedding to trap her in their web of liabilities. I asked Owen if there was any way to quietly warn the venue management about the impending fraud without breaking my promise to stay in the shadows. I did not want the vendors to be cheated, but I also could not step in and pay the bill myself. Doing so would only validate the Evans family and teach Natalie that disrespect carried no consequences. Owen paused, and the silence stretched over the phone line for several seconds. "Leo," he said, his tone turning remarkably careful, "you do not need to warn the venue." I frowned, asking him what he meant by that. Owen explained the corporate hierarchy behind the estate. The Grand Pinnacle Estate is managed by a luxury hospitality group called Apex Horizons. Apex Horizons was acquired 3 years ago by a parent holding corporation. That parent corporation is owned by your private equity portfolio. Leo, you own the venue. I stood there in the quiet dust of my garage, letting the sheer magnificent absurdity of the situation wash over me. My daughter and her fraudulent fiancé had sent me a list of 30 rules to attend a wedding at a property that legally belonged to me. They had ordered me to park my truck hidden away in the vendor lot of a building I possessed. They had banished me to table 14 near the swinging kitchen doors inside a grand ballroom that my money maintained. The breathtaking arrogance of the Evans family was matched only by their ignorance. They had looked at my oil-stained hands and my old boots and assumed I was a peasant begging for entry into their royal court. They had no idea they were demanding access to my castle. Owen waited patiently on the line. He knew I needed a moment to process the irony. When I finally spoke, my voice was resolute. "Owen, I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said. "You are not going to cancel this wedding. You are not going to call Blake, and you are certainly not going to warn Natalie. You are going to let them put on their rented tuxedos and step into their expensive dresses. The wedding proceeds exactly as scheduled, but I continued, you are going to call the general manager of the Grand Pinnacle Estate. You will inform him that he is receiving a direct order from ownership regarding the Evans wedding. When the $80,000 invoice comes due on the morning of the ceremony, the manager is to enforce a strict and zero-tolerance policy on the payment. There will be no grace periods. There will be no splitting the bill across 10 different declining credit cards. There will be no IOUs and no promises to pay after the reception. The payment must clear in full, cleanly, and immediately. If their cards decline, the doors to the grand ballroom do not open. The caterers do not serve the food. The venue remains locked until the balance is settled in full. After hanging up the phone, I looked around the garage. I ran my fingers over the smooth, sanded wood of the workbench. Diane and I had always tried to teach Natalie the value of hard work. We wanted her to understand that true security comes from honesty and effort, not from flashy titles and leased luxury sedans. But somewhere along the way, she had been seduced by the glittering deception that Blake offered. She chose the illusion of prestige over the reality of unconditional love. I felt no joy in setting this trap. I was a father preparing to watch his daughter touch a hot stove because it was the only way she would ever learn not to burn alive. I was not setting a trap made of lies. I was setting a trap made of the truth. I was simply removing the invisible safety nets that the Evans family had relied on for their entire lives. I was ensuring that the real world, the world of actual consequences and firm boundaries, would crash into their fantasy on the very day they intended to celebrate their triumph. They wanted a high society wedding they could not afford. They wanted to humiliate a father they believed was worthless. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them reality. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. The late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across my front porch. When the doorbell rang, I was sitting at the kitchen table nursing my second cup of black coffee of the day. It was the kind of deep settling quiet that only comes when you live alone for a long time. I walked slowly to the front door, opening it to find my daughter Natalie standing on the welcome mat. She looked frantic. She wore a tailored beige trench coat and gripped her expensive leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Her posture was rigid, projecting an air of manufactured emergency. She stepped past me without waiting for an invitation, bringing the sharp scent of expensive floral perfume into my quiet hallway. I closed the door and followed her into the kitchen. She paced back and forth across the linoleum floor, her heels clicking in a rapid, anxious rhythm. I asked her what was wrong. She stopped and turned to face me, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh before launching into her prepared speech. She said there was a crisis with the wedding florist. She explained that the vendor had suddenly increased their pricing for the imported white orchids she had to have for the centerpieces. She said the new total was $15,000, and the florist needed the payment immediately or they would walk away from the contract. She was breathing heavily, trying to convey a sense of impending doom. I remained still, leaning against the kitchen counter. I asked her why she was bringing this to me. She rolled her eyes, looking at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. She said that Blake and his family were already doing so much. She stated with conviction that Mr. and Mrs. Evans were covering the entire $80,000 venue cost out of their own pockets. She said it was only fair that I stepped up and contributed something meaningful to my own daughter's wedding. She told me it was the least I could do, considering I was not paying for the catering or the venue or the band. I listened to her lie directly to my face. She stood in the kitchen where her mother and I had raised her, and she used a fabricated story to try and shame me into handing over my money. I remembered Diane standing at the stove scraping burnt rice out of a cheap aluminum pan during our first year of marriage. We were so poor back then that we shared a single winter coat. We never complained because we had each other, and we had our integrity. We built our fortune by respecting the truth and honoring our debts. Now our only child was standing in this very same room, using deception to fund a party she could not afford. I knew, for in fact, that Blake and his parents had not paid a single dime toward that venue. I knew because I owned the venue. I knew because Owen had already confirmed the Evans family was drowning in $400,000 of consumer debt and was planning to swipe a stack of maxed-out credit cards on the morning of the ceremony. Natalie was using the illusion of their generosity as a weapon to extract money from her supposedly broke father. She was projecting their imaginary wealth to highlight my imaginary poverty. A wave of sadness washed over me. I looked at Natalie and tried to find the little girl who used to help me plant tomatoes in the backyard. The little girl who used to run to the driveway covered in mud, holding up a bruised worm like it was a gold trophy. I tried to find the girl who understood the value of $1 and the importance of honesty. But that girl was gone. In her place stood a stranger who was willing to manipulate her own father to maintain a fake image for a family of fraudsters. She was so desperate to impress Blake and his parents that she was willing to treat me like an ATM machine while simultaneously ordering me to hide my old pickup truck in the vendor lot. I could have stopped her right there. I could have pulled out the thin manila folder Owen had given me. I could have dropped the financial reports on the kitchen table and exposed the Evans family for the parasites they were. I could have told her that she was marrying into debt and that her future in-laws were treating her like a financial life raft. I could have told her that I was a multimillionaire and that she was demanding $15,000 from the man who actually owned the estate where she was getting married. But I did not say a single word. If I confronted her, she would just get defensive. She would call me a liar or accuse me of trying to sabotage her happiness out of spite. She would run back to Blake, and he would spin some new web of lies to convince her that I was the problem. She had to learn the truth on her own. She had to feel the consequences of her arrogance. I had to let her have exactly what she wanted, so she could see exactly what it cost. I walked slowly to the kitchen drawer where I kept my checkbook. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the counter. Natalie watched me, her expression shifting from defensive anger to triumphant relief. She thought she had won. She thought her manipulation had worked on her helpless, gullible father. She thought she had successfully shamed me into compliance. She probably assumed this $15,000 was coming out of a meager retirement savings account, leaving me struggling to pay for groceries next month. The imported white orchids were simply more important to her than my financial security. I picked up a blue pen and carefully wrote out the date. I wrote the name of the florist. I filled in the amount of $15,000. My hand did not shake. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. Writing this check was not a defeat. I was investing $15,000 to secure the trap. By handing over this money without a fight, I was cementing my facade of weakness. I was giving them the ultimate false sense of security. They would look at this check and believe they had total control over me. They would walk into the wedding day blind to the reality waiting for them. I signed my name at the bottom of the check. I tore it carefully along the perforated edge. The sound of the tearing paper seemed loud in the quiet kitchen. I turned around and handed the small slip of paper to my daughter. She took it quickly, slipping it into her designer handbag. She offered me a brief, practiced smile. She said thank you and told me this would really help them out. She did not ask how I was feeling or what I had been doing that day. Her mission was complete. She had extracted the funds, and now she was eager to leave the presence of her embarrassing blue-collar father. She told me she had to rush back to the city to meet Blake for a cake tasting. She turned and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I followed her to the front door and watched her climb into her leased luxury sedan. I watched the car back out of the driveway and disappear down the suburban street. I stood on the porch for a long time, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my face. I was not angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a cold clarity. That check was the very last piece of financial support Natalie would ever receive from me. It was the final transaction between us under these false pretenses. I had played my part perfectly. I had absorbed their insults. I had accepted their 30 humiliating rules. I had smiled at their patronizing comments, and now I had funded their floral arrangements. The pieces were all exactly where they needed to be. Blake and his parents were marching toward a financial cliff, and they were holding my daughter's hand while they did it. I had done everything in my power to prepare the lesson. Now all I had to do was pack my bags and head to the airport. The illusion of my weakness was complete. Their blind overconfidence was absolute. The trap was ready to snap shut. I walked into the living room and sat down in my favorite armchair. I picked up the framed photograph of Diane from the side table and stared at her smiling face. I told her I was sorry it had to come to this. I told her I was going to make sure our daughter finally learned the difference between the price of things and the true value of people. I promised her I would stand firm even when the tears started flowing. Then I returned the photograph to the table. The trip was still 2 weeks away. I was not leaving that night, but I had stopped playing the role of the submissive old man. The time for quietly absorbing their disrespect had ended. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark kitchen. It had been exactly 2 days since I handed my daughter the $15,000 check for her white orchids. It was the kind of silence that usually felt heavy and oppressive, but tonight it felt like an open door. I sat at the oak table and typed a web address into the browser. For years, I had avoided looking at travel websites because they only reminded me of the plans Diane and I never got to finish. We always talked about going to Maui. We had a whole folder full of magazine clippings and handwritten itineraries stuffed in a drawer somewhere. We promised each other we would go as soon as the company hit its first big milestone. But then she got sick, and the money we made no longer mattered because no amount of wealth could buy her a cure. I typed Maui into the destination box. I selected a date exactly 2 weeks away, the exact same date as Natalie's wedding. I did not look for economy seats or budget hotels. I selected a first-class direct flight and booked an oceanfront suite at a luxury resort. I paid for it all with a single click using a private account that held more money than Blake and his parents could ever comprehend. The confirmation screen loaded, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt a genuine spark of anticipation. I was finally taking our trip. I was going to see the ocean exactly the way Diane had wanted us to see it. It was a reclamation of my life. I closed the laptop and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. I pulled an old leather suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I wiped the dust off the top and laid it flat on the bed. I started packing clothes I had not touched in a decade. Light linen shirts, comfortable trousers, and leather sandals. I packed my favorite sunglasses and a new book I had been meaning to read. As I folded each item, I felt the heavy, invisible coat of the tired blue-collar pensioner slipping off my shoulders. I was leaving the grease-stained shirts and the scuffed boots behind. I was leaving the persona that allowed my daughter to treat me like a burden. I packed the framed photograph of Diane, carefully wrapping it in a soft sweater so the glass would not break during the flight. Beside it, I placed the small wooden vial holding a portion of her ashes, the one thing I had always planned to carry when we finally reached Maui. I told her we were finally going to the island. I knew she would be proud of me for standing up for myself. Once the suitcase was packed and resting by the door, I walked back to the kitchen. I turned on the overhead light and sat down at the table. I placed the printed list of 30 wedding rules on the left side of me. I pulled out a crisp sheet of heavy cotton paper and a black fountain pen, placing them on my right. I did not want to send a text message or a careless email. I wanted to leave a physical document, a tangible piece of evidence that Natalie could hold in her hands. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. I uncapped the pen and began to write. I kept my handwriting slow and deliberate. I addressed it simply to Natalie. I told her I was writing this letter to formally respond to the document she and Blake had sent me. I looked at her printed rules. I started with Rule 4, the mandate that I must park my old truck in the dirt lot behind the venue so the guests would not see it. I wrote that I understood her concern about appearances. I told her she would not have to worry about my truck ruining the aesthetic of the Grand Pinnacle estate, because my truck would be parked in the long-term lot at the international airport. I moved down her list. I looked at Rule 12, which demanded I never discuss my past work history or my current living situation with anyone at the reception. I wrote that I found this rule wise. I told her it was truly best if the guests did not know my work history. I explained that if they knew I had built a heavy machinery empire from scratch and sold it for $18 million, they might start asking uncomfortable questions. They might wonder why her supposedly wealthy new-in-laws were secretly drowning in $400,000 of high-interest consumer debt. I wrote that her secret was safe with me because I would not be speaking to a single guest. I looked at Rule 18, which required me to wear a cheap rented suit that Blake had pre-approved. I wrote that I was returning the rented suit to the shop tomorrow morning. I explained that I would instead be wearing a comfortable linen shirt, because the weather in Hawaii required a much more relaxed wardrobe. I told her I hoped Blake enjoyed his tuxedo, because he was going to need to look his best when the venue manager asked him to pay the remaining balance. Then I found Rule 29, the rule that banished me to table 14 near the swinging kitchen doors. The rule that attempted to erase me from the head table so Blake and his parents could pretend they were the sole providers of her happiness. I wrote that she was right to keep table 14 empty. I told her she would need the extra space when the caterers packed up their equipment and walked out of the building. I explained that I had instructed the management of the Grand Pinnacle estate, which is owned by my private equity portfolio, to enforce a zero-tolerance policy on the final $80,000 payment. I wrote that when Blake's credit cards inevitably declined, the ballroom would remain closed to the event. I told her she would not have to worry about me sitting in the shadows because there would be no reception at all. Finally, I reached the end of her document. I looked at Rule 30, the ultimate ultimatum. I read the words stating that if I could not abide by every rule on the list without complaint, I should not attend the wedding. The anger had vanished, leaving only a sense of closure. I wrote my final paragraph. I told my daughter that for my entire life, I had done everything in my power to provide for her and protect her. I told her I had happily worn grease on my hands so she could wear clean clothes, but I explained that I could not protect her from her own arrogance. I wrote that I had read Rule 30 very carefully. I told her that since I could not in good conscience abide by her humiliating conditions, I was doing exactly what she requested. I was not attending the wedding. I signed my name at the bottom of the page simply as Dad. I folded the heavy cotton paper in thirds and slid it into a thick white envelope. I sealed the flap and wrote Natalie's name on the front. Instead of leaving it at the house, I placed it with my travel documents. I had already arranged for a bonded courier to meet me at the airport on the morning of the ceremony. He would take the envelope from me there and deliver it directly to the bridal suite at exactly 3 p.m, 1 hour before the wedding was supposed to begin. The timing mattered. Natalie would read the letter while the venue crisis was still unfolding, and while Blake was discovering that confidence could not pay an $80,000 balance. I stood up from the table and turned off the kitchen light. I walked down the dark hallway and looked at my packed leather suitcase resting by the front door. I had 2 weeks left to wait, but my mind was already on the island. I imagined the warm breeze coming off the Pacific Ocean. I imagined the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I imagined the peace of knowing I had finally stopped setting myself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. I went to sleep that night, feeling lighter than I had in years. The countdown to the wedding day had officially begun, and I was ready for the storm to hit. The fabric of the rented suit scratched against my neck like sandpaper. It was a cheap polyester blend that smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals and old dust. The sleeves were a fraction too short, and the shoulders felt stiff, restricting my movement. It was exactly the kind of suit you would put on a man if you wanted him to look like a tired mechanic playing dress-up for a night. That was precisely why Blake had selected it for me. I buttoned the jacket and looked at myself in the mirror before leaving my house. I did not look like the man who sold a heavy machinery empire for $18 million. I looked like a man who barely had enough to pay his electric bill. I smiled at my reflection because the disguise was absolutely flawless. I drove my old truck to the country club where the rehearsal dinner was being held. It was not the grand estate where the wedding would take place tomorrow, but it was an upscale venue with valet parking and manicured lawns. I handed my keys to the young valet attendant, who looked at my rusted truck with a hint of confusion before driving it away. I walked up the stone steps and entered the private dining room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just observing the room. Blake and his parents were holding court near the center of the room. Mr. Evans was loudly telling a story to a group of groomsmen, gesturing wildly with a glass of bourbon in his hand. Mrs. Evans was dripping in sparkling jewelry that I now knew was entirely financed by suffocating credit card debt. They moved with the exaggerated confidence of people who desperately needed everyone to believe they were wealthy. Natalie stood next to Blake wearing a stunning silk dress. She looked beautiful, but her smile seemed tight and anxious. She was constantly scanning the room, making sure everything was perfect, making sure no one was looking out of place, making sure I was not ruining her carefully constructed image. A hostess holding a clipboard approached me and asked for my name. I told her I was the father of the bride. She checked the seating chart, and her professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She guided me past the beautiful floral centerpieces and past the head table where the Evans family would sit, then led me to the very back of the room. She pulled out a chair at a small table tucked beside the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter passed through, I heard dirty plates clattering and kitchen staff calling orders. The seat was deliberately out of the main sightline. I sat down and placed my hands on the white linen tablecloth. Rule number 29 had not even reached the wedding day yet, but the message was already in effect. I was expected to be present and invisible. I sat in silence and watched the charade unfold. I watched the Evans family order bottles of premium wine for their table, sending the waiters back and forth with demanding requests. I watched them toast and laugh and celebrate. I knew the truth behind their grand performance. I knew they were drowning in $400,000 of liabilities. I knew Blake was a mid-level employee with a fake title. I knew that the $15,000 check I had written just a few days ago was likely the only reason this dinner was even happening. They were gorging themselves on top-shelf liquor and fine dining entirely funded by my money or my daughter's desperate savings. They were celebrating a victory lap on a track they did not even own. When dinner was finally served, the waiters brought thick cuts of prime steak to the head table. When they reached my back table, they placed a piece of dry, overcooked chicken and a few limp vegetables in front of me. I picked up my fork and knife and cut into it. It was tough and tasteless. I chewed slowly and did not complain to the waiter. I did not glare toward the Evans family. I savored that dry chicken because every bite reminded me why I had booked a first-class ticket to Maui. Every bite strengthened my resolve. I was absorbing their disrespect one final time. As the dinner plates were cleared away, the room quieted down. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass rang out. Mrs. Evans stood up at the head table. She smoothed her elegant dress and offered a bright, beaming smile to the room. She began her toast by talking about Blake. She spoke about his brilliant career, his ambition, and his supposedly impeccable taste. She painted him as a prince who was destined for greatness. Then she turned her body slightly to look down at Natalie. The tone of her voice shifted. It became sickeningly sweet and dripping with patronizing condescension. She said they were just so thrilled to welcome Natalie into their family. She said it was truly a beautiful thing to watch a young woman step up into a world of real culture and refined society. Then she raised her glass higher and delivered the ultimate insult. She said they were incredibly proud to be rescuing Natalie from her modest beginnings and saving her from a life of absolute mediocrity. The words hung in the air. Rescuing her from a life of absolute mediocrity. She looked directly past the crowd, straight toward the back of the room, where I was sitting near the kitchen doors. It was a deliberate, calculated strike aimed right at the tired mechanic in the cheap rented suit. She was publicly declaring that my entire life, my hard work, and the home Diane and I built for our daughter were nothing but mediocre trash that needed to be left behind. I did not stand up. I did not throw my napkin on the table or shout across the room. I reached inside the pocket of my stiff polyester jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened the voice memo application. I hit record. I sat there in the shadows and recorded every single word of her arrogant speech. I captured the sound of the guests clapping politely. I captured the loud booming sound of Blake laughing in total agreement with his mother. I looked at Natalie. She was staring down at her lap, her cheeks flushed red. She did not defend me. She did not defend the memory of her mother. She just sat there and took the insult because she was too desperate to fit in to speak the truth. I stopped the recording and slid the phone back into my pocket. That audio file was a masterpiece. It was the perfect culmination of their delusion. I planned to listen to it while sitting on the balcony of my oceanfront suite in Hawaii while sipping a glass of expensive bourbon. It would be the ultimate soundtrack to their downfall. The rehearsal dinner stretched on for another hour. Blake and his father moved out to the patio to smoke expensive cigars, laughing loudly into the night air. They postured and posed, acting like kings who had successfully conquered a new territory. They believed they had completely broken my spirit. They thought tomorrow would be the crowning achievement of their social climbing careers. They thought they were going to walk into the grand estate and finalize their acquisition of my daughter and her financial stability. I did not stay for dessert. I wiped my mouth with the white linen napkin and stood from the back table near the swinging kitchen doors. I crossed the dining room without going to the head table to say goodbye. Blake and his father were already talking about post-dinner champagne and cigars, as if tomorrow were a coronation. I reached the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the main corridor, loosening the stiff rented collar as the laughter faded behind me. The rehearsal was over. They had delivered their lines with enough arrogance to erase any remaining doubt about what tomorrow needed to teach them. I was ready to leave, quietly drive home, and let the final part of my promise begin. Before I reached the glass exit doors, high heels clicked rapidly behind me. Natalie had followed me into the dim hallway. She grabbed my arm and pulled me farther from the dining room, where the staff and guests could not hear. The sharp scent of her perfume filled the narrow space. She did not ask whether the toast about rescuing her from mediocrity had hurt me. She looked over the cheap suit first, then demanded to know why I thought I could leave before the evening was finished. She did not ask if her future mother-in-law's cruel speech had hurt my feelings or caused me any distress. Instead, her eyes darted nervously up and down the cheap rented suit I was wearing. She demanded to know where I thought I was going in a harsh, panicked whisper. She reminded me that the evening was not even over yet, and Blake was just about to order the post-dinner champagne. I looked down at the hand she had wrapped around my sleeve, and then up into her eyes. I told her calmly that it was getting late, and I needed to rest for the big day tomorrow. She let go of my arm and crossed her own, letting out a sharp, exasperated breath. She told me she needed to make something clear before tomorrow morning, because she could not risk any surprises ruining her perfect day. She said the rehearsal dinner was just a small, casual gathering, but the actual wedding at the estate was going to be packed with Blake's highly influential network and his important corporate colleagues. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping an octave as she issued her final strict warning. She told me I needed to be on my best behavior tomorrow. She reminded me not to speak unless someone directly asked me a question, and she reiterated that I was not under any circumstances to wander away from table 14 to mingle with the Evans family guests. She looked at me with a coldness that chilled me to the very bone, and told me she could not afford for me to embarrass her in front of people who actually mattered in the real world. She said Blake's parents had worked too hard to build their social reputation, and she would not let my lack of social grace tear it down. Then she brought up the email. She asked me if I remembered rule number 30. She recited it to me word for word, standing there in the lavish hallway under the glowing crystal wall sconces. If you cannot abide by every rule on this list without complaint, do not attend the wedding. She told me that Blake was already stressed about the venue logistics, the final vendor payments, and the timing of the reception. The last thing he needed, she explained, was to manage a rogue family member who did not know how to blend into the background. She demanded that I verbally confirm I understood the rules and intended to follow them without causing a scene. I searched her face desperately, trying to find a single trace of the little girl Diane and I had raised with so much love and endless sacrifice. I looked for the bright-eyed child who used to run out to the driveway when she heard the rumble of my truck, eager to show me a drawing she had made at school. I looked for the girl who used to sit on the wooden porch steps and share a simple bowl of vanilla ice cream with me on warm summer nights, listening to the crickets chirping in the yard. I looked for the teenager who once hugged me tight and told me she never wanted to care about money or status as long as she had a family who truly loved her. I tried with every fiber of my being to find the daughter who used to hold my grease-stained hands without a single ounce of shame or hesitation. But looking at her now, staring into her impatient eyes, all I saw was a hollow shell painted over with the fake prestige she had so eagerly bought into. Her posture was rigid and defensive, wrapped in expensive fabrics that could not hide her deep insecurities. Her expression was arrogant and devoid of any basic human empathy. Her heart was closed off to the man who had provided her with a beautiful, safe childhood. The illusion of status had devoured her soul, leaving behind a stranger who viewed her own father as an ugly blemish on her perfect new life. She had willingly traded her integrity and her family for the illusion of immense wealth, and she was blind to the fact that the people she was trying so desperately to impress were nothing but financial parasites waiting to bleed her dry. The sadness that had been lingering in my chest all evening evaporated, leaving behind a solid, immovable clarity. I did not feel the urge to defend myself or remind her of the countless sacrifices I had made to ensure she never went hungry a single day in her life. I realized in that exact moment that protecting her from the truth would only enable her delusion. She had chosen her path, and she had chosen her new family. If I continued to absorb her disrespect, I would only be reinforcing the terrible lessons Blake and his parents had taught her. She needed to learn that actions have consequences, and that treating people like disposable burdens comes with a very heavy price. I looked directly into her cold, anxious eyes. I did not blink, and I did not look away. I kept my voice level and devoid of any anger, malice, or lingering sorrow. It was the voice of a man who had made a final, irrevocable decision. "I promise you, Natalie," I said slowly and deliberately, letting each word hang in the air between us, "I will not be a problem at your wedding, at your—" She stared at me for a long, tense moment, searching my face for any hint of sarcasm, rebellion, or hidden resentment. Finding only calm acceptance, her tense shoulders finally relaxed, dropping an inch as the anxiety left her body. She let out a heavy sigh of relief, truly believing she had successfully put the embarrassing old mechanic in his proper place. She believed she had asserted her dominance and secured my unquestioning obedience for the most important day of her life. She offered a tight, practiced nod. A gesture devoid of any familial warmth told me to make sure I was not late to the dirt vendor parking lot tomorrow afternoon, and turned on her heel. I listened to the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her shoes as she walked back to the dining room to rejoin her fake high society family, abandoning me in the shadows. I watched the heavy wooden doors close behind her, sealing her inside her own manufactured delusion. I turned and walked out the glass exit doors into the cool night air. Tomorrow she would learn exactly how faithfully I intended to keep it. I walked across the wet pavement toward my old truck, feeling a sense of liberation. The heavy burden of trying to be the father she wanted was gone, replaced by the peaceful certainty of the lesson she was about to learn. I opened the door of my truck and climbed inside, knowing that when the sun rose tomorrow morning, I would be stepping onto an airplane while her entire world crashed down around her. The dawn broke clear and bright over the quiet suburban streets, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and pale purple. I woke up exactly at 6 in the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through my bedroom window. The house was silent, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence. I walked into the kitchen and brewed my final pot of dark roast coffee. I stood by the granite counter and drank it slowly, letting the bitter warmth wake my senses and steady my mind. I walked down the hallway past the guest room, where the cheap polyester suit hung limply against the closet door. I left the suit right there as a physical monument to the ridiculous charade I was finally walking away from. The days of making myself smaller to fit into their arrogant narrative were officially over. I took a warm shower and dressed in the light linen shirt and comfortable tailored trousers I had packed the night before. I picked up my old leather suitcase from the floor of the hallway. I walked out the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt, listening to the satisfying mechanical click echo on the porch. I stepped down the wooden stairs and breathed in the crisp morning air. The neighborhood was still asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to hit a certain high society wedding. I threw my suitcase into the back of my rusted Chevy Silverado and climbed into the familiar driver's seat. I turned the key, and the heavy engine roared to life with its comforting, reliable rumble. I pulled out of the driveway and did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove through the quiet streets, passing the houses of neighbors who were probably just waking up to start their weekend routines. I merged onto the main highway, but I did not take the eastern exit that led toward the sprawling, manicured hills of the Grand Pinnacle Estate. Instead, I kept driving straight, following the large green overhead signs pointing toward the international airport. I listened to the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt and felt a sense of calm wash over me. I was not stressed about floral arrangements or seating charts. I was simply a man going on a well-deserved vacation to an island he should have visited decades ago. I pulled into the long-term parking structure at the airport and found a spot near the main elevators. I grabbed my suitcase and the thick white envelope I had carefully sealed the night before. I walked into the bustling main departure terminal. The air was filled with the sound of rolling luggage and overlapping boarding announcements overhead. I stood near the designated meeting spot next to a large coffee kiosk, watching the crowd of travelers rush past me. Exactly on time, a man wearing a crisp dark blue uniform with a bonded courier badge approached my location. He asked if I was Leo Campbell, and I nodded, handing him the heavy white envelope. I told him this envelope contained highly sensitive personal documents and required precision in its handling. I instructed him to drive directly to the Grand Pinnacle Estate. I told him he must bypass the front reception desk and go straight upstairs to the bridal suite. I told him he was to place the envelope directly into the hands of Natalie Campbell and no one else. Finally, I gave him the most important instruction of all. I told him the envelope must be delivered at exactly 3 in the afternoon, not a single minute earlier and not a single minute later. I handed him a very generous cash tip to ensure his dedication to the precise schedule. He nodded, firmly placed the envelope into his secure leather satchel, and walked away, disappearing into the busy crowd of morning travelers. The point of no return had been permanently crossed. I walked through the premium security checkpoint with ease, leaving the noise of the main terminal behind me. I made my way to the first-class departure lounge and waited in a quiet leather armchair until my flight to Maui was called over the loudspeaker. The flight attendant greeted me warmly and directed me to my window seat in the front cabin. The seat was wide and comfortable, covered in soft, dark leather that felt a world away from the scratchy rented suit I was supposed to be wearing. I stowed my small bag and sat down, stretching my legs out in front of me. I looked out the large oval window at the baggage handlers working on the tarmac below, feeling the heavy, invisible weight of my daughter's judgment finally lift from my shoulders. A few minutes later, the flight attendant approached my row and asked if I would care for a beverage before takeoff. I asked her for a glass of their best bourbon neat. She returned quickly with a heavy crystal glass filled with rich amber liquid. I held the glass in my hand, feeling the smooth weight of the crystal against my palm. I looked out the window as the engines of the plane began to whine and spin up, preparing for our imminent departure. I raised my glass toward the clouds in a quiet, solitary toast. I toasted to Diane, thanking her for giving me the strength to finally demand respect. I toasted to the truth, knowing it was about to hit the Evans family with the destructive force of a hurricane. It burned slightly on the way down, leaving a rich, warm finish. It tasted like freedom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was clear of notifications. The wedding ceremony was still hours away, and Natalie was likely sitting in a plush chair, getting her hair and makeup done, surrounded by oblivious bridesmaids. She believed her day was going according to her rigid plan. She believed her father was currently driving his rusted truck to the dirt vendor lot, preparing to sit quietly by the kitchen doors like an obedient servant. I swiped down on the screen and tapped the airplane icon. I placed the phone back into my pocket, cutting myself off from the mainland and the impending disaster. The plane taxied down the runway, accelerated with immense power, and lifted smoothly into the sky, leaving the city and all its manufactured drama far behind me. While I was high above the clouds, the first part of the trap was beginning on the ground. At the Grand Pinnacle Estate, the staff waited for financial clearance before releasing the ballroom for the reception. The caterers stood ready in the commercial kitchen, and the florists remained with the white orchids. Shortly before the final balance came due, the venue manager carried the payment terminal toward the reception desk. Blake and his parents were nearby in their formal clothes, still confident that the day belonged to them. The manager explained that the remaining $80,000 had to clear under the contract before the ballroom and reception services could be released. No promise to settle later would replace actual payment. Blake reached into his tuxedo pocket with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed another card could always buy more time. I did not know the exact sequence because my phone was already in airplane mode, and Owen was observing as my proxy. I knew only that the manager would enforce the same written policy applied to every client, and that nobody from my company would rescue the Evans family from a declined payment. The venue staff had been told to remain professional, keep the ballroom unreleased, and document whatever happened at the desk. Blake still believed the final charge was a minor inconvenience. His parents still believed confidence could substitute for cash. Somewhere below me, the terminal began processing the first card, while I watched the mainland disappear beneath the clouds. The trap was sprung not by a secret trick, but by the bill they had promised to pay. He had no idea I owned the company behind the room he was trying to enter. The heavy wheels of the airplane touched down on the tarmac with a solid, comforting thud. The engines roared as they reversed thrust, slowing the large aircraft down against the warm Hawaiian air. I looked out the small oval window, watching the lush green mountains rise up against a brilliant blue sky. It was different from the gray, rainy city I had left behind hours ago. When the cabin doors finally opened, a wave of humid tropical heat washed over my face, carrying the faint, sweet scent of tropical flowers and salt water. I walked up the jet bridge, feeling the stiff, tired muscles in my back loosen with every step. The airport in Maui was open and airy, with warm sunlight pouring through large glass panels in the ceiling. People around me were smiling, wearing brightly colored shirts, and moving at a slow, relaxed pace. There was no rushing, no frantic anxiety, and no manufactured prestige to be found anywhere. I walked past the bustling arrival gates, carrying my single leather suitcase. I did not need to wait at the crowded baggage carousel. I walked straight out the sliding glass doors and stepped onto the sun-baked concrete of the passenger pickup area. The gentle trade winds blew past me, rustling the broad green leaves of the tall palm trees lining the street. I took a deep, long breath, filling my lungs with the clean ocean air. I felt like a man who had successfully shed a heavy, suffocating skin. Diane would have loved this beautiful place. I looked up at the clear sky and smiled, knowing I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I walked over to a quiet wooden bench sitting under the thick shade of a large banyan tree. I sat down and placed my old leather suitcase next to my feet. The black screen reflected the bright tropical sun. For a long moment, I just held the silent device in the palm of my hand. I knew that the very moment I turned off airplane mode, the digital dam would break. It was currently mid-afternoon on the island, which meant the sun had already set back on the mainland. The lavish wedding ceremony, the extravagant reception. The entire grand event was supposed to have happened many hours ago. The financial explosion at the venue manager's desk was already a matter of established historical fact. I swiped my thumb across the smooth screen and tapped the airplane icon, turning the cellular connection back on. For 2 seconds, the phone remained silent, searching the island for a local cell tower. Then the signal connected and the device erupted. The phone began to vibrate in my hand with a violent mechanical intensity. The screen froze, struggling to process the sudden influx of data. A continuous stream of notifications began cascading down the display like a relentless digital waterfall. The chime for missed calls rang over and over again, blending into a single solid tone of panic. I sat back against the wooden bench and watched the numbers climb higher and higher. The bright red notification badge on my phone icon stopped at exactly 85 missed calls from Natalie. Right below that were 14 missed calls from Blake. My text message inbox was flooded with dozens of unread messages from unknown numbers that I safely assumed belonged to the furious, embarrassed Evans family. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety as I watched the screen flash with their desperate attempts to reach me. I did not feel the usual parental instinct to rush back and execute a rescue mission. That deeply ingrained instinct had been thoroughly extinguished by their 30 humiliating rules and their relentless, unearned arrogance. I sat under the shade of the banyan tree, feeling nothing but a sense of validation. The reality they had tried so hard to ignore had finally caught up with them. Blake and his parents had walked into the Grand Pinnacle estate, expecting to coast through the day on a wave of fake credit and blind entitlement. They had expected to bully their way past the venue manager, just like they had bullied their way through life. Instead, they had collided headfirst into a solid brick wall of corporate policy enforced by the very man they had banished to the shadows. I slowly scrolled through the text messages without opening them, reading the preview lines on my locked screen. The timeline of their panic was meticulously documented hour by hour. The early messages from Natalie were filled with annoyance, demanding to know why my rusted truck was not parked in the hidden vendor lot. Then the tone shifted drastically. The messages sent around 10 in the morning were frantic questions, asking where I was and telling me Blake was having a minor issue with his bank. The messages sent at noon were written in all capital letters, begging me to answer the phone because the ballroom was being kept closed and the wealthy guests were starting to arrive in the grand lobby. The final messages, sent late in the afternoon, were incoherent strings of sheer terror. I opened my voicemail application. I tapped on the very first audio message Natalie had left me. It was recorded exactly at 10:30 in the morning, just half an hour after the final $80,000 payment had come due. I raised the volume and held the phone close to my ear. The background noise on the recording was chaotic and loud. I could hear the muffled echoes of the grand marble lobby and the sharp sound of people arguing loudly in the distance. I could clearly hear Mr. Evans shouting at someone, demanding to speak to the owner of the building. Then Natalie's voice cut through the static. She was not using her polished, high society tone. She was breathless, and her voice trembled with a raw, desperate panic. She screamed into the receiver, demanding that I pick up the phone immediately. She said there was a catastrophic misunderstanding with the venue manager. She said Blake was standing at the front desk, and every one of his platinum credit cards was being declined. She explained that the manager was politely refusing to open the ballroom doors, and the catering staff was threatening to leave the premises with all the food. Her voice cracked as she begged me to call her back. She said Blake's parents were screaming at the management, claiming their accounts were frozen due to a bank error, but the venue staff was treating their repeated payment demands as a serious dispute. She said early guests were already arriving for the champagne reception, and they were being forced to wait outside in the driveway. She was crying now, loud, ugly sobs of pure humiliation. She told me I needed to wire the money right now to save her from this public nightmare. She commanded me to fix the problem using the exact same arrogant tone she had used when delivering her 30 rules. The voicemail ended with the sound of her dropping the phone and crying out to Blake, asking what they were going to do now that everyone was watching them fail. I lowered the phone from my ear and stopped the playback. I sat in the tropical breeze and let the sound of her demanding tears fade away into the rustling palm leaves. She had told me in rule number 12 never to ask for handouts or expect special treatment. She had told me in rule number 30 that if I could not abide by her perfect image, I should not attend. She was currently breaking every one of her own rules because the illusion of her new family had evaporated into thin air. Blake was not a wealthy executive. His parents were not high society elites. They were terrified standing in a lobby they could not afford, trying to bully a manager who would never yield. They were experiencing the exact consequences of their endless deception. I saved it. It was the undeniable proof that I had done the right thing by walking away. I locked my phone and slid it back into the pocket of my linen trousers. I stood up from the wooden bench and picked up my leather suitcase. A bright yellow taxi pulled up to the curb, and the friendly driver asked if I needed a ride to a resort. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile and told him I was heading to the best oceanfront suite on the island. I climbed into the back seat and looked out the window as we drove toward the coast. The warm sun washed over my face, melting away the last remnants of the cold, bitter world I had left behind. The yellow taxi drove smoothly along the coastal highway of Maui. The turquoise ocean stretched out endlessly to my left, sparkling under the midday sun. I sank back into the leather seat and pulled my smartphone from my pocket once more. I had ignored the 85 frantic missed calls from my daughter and the endless string of text messages from the Evans family. But there was one notification I actually wanted to open. It was a single encrypted audio file sent directly to my secure inbox from Owen Foster. I tapped the screen and held the phone close to my ear, listening to the crisp, professional voice of my wealth manager. Owen began by telling me he was inside the grand lobby as my ownership representative and proxy. He kept to the side near a marble pillar where he could observe without interfering with the venue staff. At 9:45, the chandeliers were lit. The caterers were waiting for clearance, and the florists remained outside with the $15,000 of white orchids. Everything was suspended until the final $80,000 balance cleared. The manager had not been told to humiliate anyone. He had been told to enforce the existing contract without inventing a rescue for a client who could not pay. Owen continued his detailed narration, describing the exact moment Blake and his father walked down the sweeping staircase and approached the main reception desk. He said they walked with their chests puffed out, wearing custom-fitted black tuxedos, and projecting an air of supreme, untouchable confidence. They laughed loudly and patted each other on the back, acting like royalty preparing to survey their kingdom. They approached the venue manager, a deeply stoic professional who stood behind the polished mahogany counter. Owen said the venue manager did not smile and did not offer any warm congratulations. He simply placed a sleek wireless credit card terminal on the counter and informed Blake that the final payment of exactly $80,000 was required immediately before any further services could be rendered. Owen described how Blake offered a dismissive chuckle, waving his hand as if the sum of money was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Blake casually reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a shiny platinum credit card, dropping it onto the counter with an arrogant flick of his wrist. The venue manager picked up the card and inserted the chip into the terminal. Owen said, "The silence in the lobby seemed to stretch on for an eternity while the machine processed the transaction. Then a sharp, loud beep echoed across the marble room. The screen flashed bright red, reading transaction declined. Owen noted that Blake did not immediately panic. Blake simply laughed again, shaking his head and telling the venue manager that his bank was terribly overly cautious about large weekend transactions. He claimed it was a standard security fraud alert. He casually pulled a second credit card from his wallet, a heavy metal card that looked very impressive, and handed it over. The venue manager swiped the card without a single change in his facial expression. The terminal hummed for 2 seconds before emitting that same sharp, loud beep of rejection. Transaction declined. Owen said he watched the smug, arrogant smile slowly melt right off Blake's face. The false confidence evaporated, instantly replaced by a sudden tight look of genuine confusion. Blake frantically dug into his wallet and pulled out a third card, muttering under his breath about incompetent bank tellers and automated security algorithms. He practically shoved the card into the machine himself. Another loud beep rang out across the quiet lobby. Another red screen. Another decline. Owen said Blake's hands began to tremble visibly as he swiped a fourth and final credit card. 4 separate cards from 4 different banking institutions, all maxed out and incapable of covering his fraudulent lifestyle. At that point, Blake's father stepped forward, insisting there had to be a banking error and demanding an exception. He offered to call his bank and make promises about funds arriving later that day. The venue manager refused to treat a future promise as cleared payment and repeated that the event could not be released until the contracted balance was actually received. The older man began sweating through his tuxedo shirt as the early guests watched the argument grow louder. Owen narrated how the atmosphere in the lobby shifted from quiet anticipation to unbearable tension. By this time, dozens of early arriving guests had gathered near the entrance doors. These were Blake's supposed highly influential corporate colleagues and distant relatives who had flown in to witness his grand high society triumph. They were standing mere feet away, holding expensive wrapped gifts and listening to the entire humiliating exchange. Owen said the venue manager did not lower his voice to spare their feelings. He spoke with the clear, booming projection of a man who was simply enforcing corporate policy. The venue manager informed Blake and his father that all 4 attempted transactions had failed due to insufficient funds. He stated very clearly that without the immediate transfer of $80,000 in secured liquid capital, the grand ballroom would remain closed to event access, and the event would be terminated. The guests began to murmur as the Evans family argued with the manager. Blake's father demanded to speak to the owner and threatened legal action. The manager told him ownership had authorized the policy and repeated that they could either produce cleared funds or step away from the desk while the event remained closed. When the family refused repeated requests to calm down and began threatening staff, the manager warned that security would end the event and local police would be called to document the escalating disturbance and disputed payment representations. By early afternoon, the crisis had dragged on long enough that guests were no longer pretending it was a minor banking delay. Staff were fielding questions in the lobby while the ballroom remained unavailable. The caterers had stopped preparing. The floral installation had not been released, and people who had arrived expecting champagne were now watching the Evans family argue over a payment terminal. Owen said Blake kept demanding more time and repeatedly told staff someone needed to reach Natalie upstairs. The bride had been kept away from the desk while hair, makeup, and photographs continued in the bridal suite, but the noise below was becoming impossible to hide. Owen ended his report with Blake pacing near the reception counter and blaming everyone except himself. He had already told venue staff that Natalie's father would fix the balance as soon as they reached me. His parents were trying to keep guests from leaving while pretending the problem was a routine banking delay. Owen knew the courier was due at 3 and told me the next hour belonged to the letter. Natalie had not yet walked into the lobby, had not confronted Blake, and had not seen the full scale of the collapse with her own eyes. That sequence needed to happen only once after she read my words. The audio file ended with Owen wishing me a wonderful, beautiful vacation on the island. I pulled the phone away from my ear and let out a long, slow breath. The taxi continued to drive down the scenic coastal road, winding past lush green hills and bright sandy beaches. I watched the ocean waves crash against the black volcanic rocks, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure wash over my soul. The Evans family had marched themselves right to the edge of the financial cliff and stepped off without needing a single push from me. They had destroyed their own illusion, and publicly. I leaned back into the comfortable seat, closing my eyes and letting the warm Hawaiian sun heat my face, knowing my daughter was currently reading the letter I had sent and understanding the full magnitude of her mistake. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, a bonded courier appeared at the bridal suite door. Natalie was already dressed in the $10,000 wedding gown, with her hair and makeup finished, while anxious bridesmaids moved around her. The courier confirmed her identity and placed the thick white envelope directly into her hands exactly as I had instructed. Natalie recognized the heavy cotton paper and my deliberate handwriting on the front. She asked for a moment of quiet, broke the seal, and unfolded the letter. "My dear Natalie," the letter began. "By the time you read these words, I will be thousands of miles away, sitting on a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I am writing this to formally respond to the document of 30 rules you and Blake sent me. For your entire life, I have done everything in my power to protect you from the harsh realities of the world. I wore grease on my hands so you could wear clean clothes. I absorbed every insult so you could feel secure in your own skin. But reading your list, I realized that protecting you had only blinded you to the truth of who you were becoming. So today, I am no longer protecting you. I am giving you the truth. Let us start with rule number 4. You demanded that I park my old truck in the dirt lot behind the venue so your high society guests would not have to look at it. You will be relieved to know that my truck is currently parked in the long-term lot at the international airport. It will not ruin your aesthetic today or ever again. Then there is rule number 12. You ordered me under no circumstances to discuss my past work history or my current living situation with any of Blake's family members. You were terrified that a retired blue-collar mechanic would embarrass your new sophisticated family. Natalie, I found this rule to be wise. It truly is best that Blake's family does not know my actual work history. If they knew that 5 years ago I sold the heavy machinery company your mother and I built from nothing for $18 million, they might start asking very uncomfortable questions. They might wonder why a man who possesses a private equity portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars lives a quiet, unassuming life, while his future in-laws put on a theatrical display of wealth they do not actually possess. The letter felt heavy in her hands. The joyful noise of the bridesmaids faded into a distant, muffled buzzing. Natalie read the next paragraph and felt the blood slowly drain from her face. Since we are discussing financial realities, I feel it is my duty as your father to share the results of a comprehensive background check I commissioned on your future husband and his parents. Blake is not a vice president of anything. He is a mid-level sales representative at a failing startup with no equity and a fabricated email signature. His parents do not dominate exclusive social circles. They are currently drowning in exactly $400,000 of high-interest consumer debt. They have second mortgages, maxed-out lines of credit, and leased vehicles they can barely afford. They are treating you as a financial life raft, Natalie. They look at your pristine credit score and your steady income as a way to fund their delusion. You are not marrying into prestige. You are marrying into a sinking ship. Natalie touched her throat, trying to swallow the sudden lump forming there. She looked back down at the page, her eyes darting across the steady ink. I also read rule number 18. You required me to wear the cheap, stiff rented suit that Blake selected for me. I returned that suit to the rental shop yesterday morning. The weather in Hawaii requires a much more relaxed wardrobe. I hope Blake enjoys wearing his custom tuxedo today because he is going to need to look his best when the venue manager asks him to pay the remaining balance. This brings me to rule number 29. You instructed me that I would not be allowed to sit at the head family table. You reserved a seat for me at table 14, hidden away near the swinging kitchen doors, so I could easily step out if I felt overwhelmed. Natalie, you were right to keep table 14 empty. In fact, you will need all the extra space you can get when the caterers pack up their equipment and walk out of the building. You see, when you told me that Blake's parents were generously covering the $80,000 cost of the Grand Pinnacle estate, I knew it was a lie. But more importantly, I knew because I own the venue. The Grand Pinnacle estate is managed by Apex Horizons, a subsidiary that is wholly owned by my investment portfolio. I did not cancel your wedding, Natalie. I simply instructed my general manager to enforce a strict zero-tolerance policy on the final payment. There will be no grace periods. There will be no split payments across maxed-out credit cards. When Blake's maxed-out cards inevitably decline downstairs, the grand ballroom will remain closed to the event. There will be no reception. Downstairs in the grand lobby, the shouting began. Even through the thick, insulated walls of the bridal suite, Natalie could hear the sudden, chaotic echoes of raised voices. She heard a man yelling with a frantic, aggressive tone. It sounded exactly like Blake's father. The panic in her chest swelled into a suffocating pressure. She read the final paragraphs of the letter, her vision blurring with hot, angry tears. A few days ago, you came to my house and manipulated me into writing a $15,000 check for your imported white orchids. You used deception to extract money from a father you believed was a helpless, broke old man. I wrote that check without a fight because it was the ultimate investment in your education. By handing over that money, I secured your blind overconfidence. That check was the very last transaction between us. It was the last dime you will ever extract from me. Finally, I reached the end of your document. Rule number 30. If you cannot abide by every rule on this list without complaint, do not attend the wedding. For my entire life, I have put your happiness above my own. I have swallowed my pride to keep your world intact. But I cannot protect you from your own arrogance. You chose the illusion of status over the reality of unconditional love. You traded your integrity for a family of con artists. So I am doing exactly what you requested. Since I cannot in good conscience abide by your humiliating conditions, I am abiding by Rule 30. I am not attending. I hope the illusion was worth the price. Dad. The heavy cotton paper slipped from Natalie's fingers and fluttered to the carpeted floor. The reality of the letter hit her with the destructive force of a collapsing building. Every word was a placed explosive detonating the entire foundation of her fake perfect life. She stood up from the vanity chair, her legs shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. The bridesmaids stopped their chattering, turning to look at her with expressions of deep concern, asking what was wrong. But Natalie could not speak. She could not breathe. She walked out of the bridal suite and moved toward the top of the grand marble staircase, looking down into the lobby below. She saw the catering staff turning their backs. She saw the wealthy guests whispering and pointing with undisguised judgment. And she saw Blake sweating profusely, his face red with panic, screaming at a calm venue manager while holding a stack of useless, declined credit cards. The illusion was dead. The truth was absolute. And the father she had thrown away to impress them was already gone. Natalie stood frozen on the second step of the grand marble staircase as the fairy tale turned into a public financial crisis. Guests were backing away from the reception desk and venue security had moved closer. The venue manager remained calm. After the Evans family refused repeated requests to step away from the desk and continued threatening staff over the failed payment, he notified local police to document the escalating disturbance and the disputed payment representations. The word police traveled through the lobby and shattered what remained of the family's confidence. The mere mention of law enforcement acted like a bucket of ice water thrown over the Evans family. The arrogant, entitled posture that Blake's father had maintained for months evaporated in a single second. Instead, his broad shoulders slumped, and a look of primal animalistic panic crossed his face. He grabbed his wife's arm, whispering frantically into her ear. Mrs. Evans looked around the lobby, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized her high society friends were staring at her with disgust. The sparkling jewelry around her neck suddenly looked exactly like what it was, cheap costume pieces bought on credit. Without saying a single word to their son, without offering any explanation or apology, they turned their backs on the crowd. They did not head for the grand front entrance. They ducked their heads and hurried toward the discreet side corridor that led to the service exits and the vendor parking lot. They were literally running away from the bill, leaving their own child behind to face the consequences. Natalie watched her future in-laws flee the scene like common thieves. A sudden surge of adrenaline broke through her paralysis. She gripped the heavy layers of her $10,000 designer wedding gown, pulling the thick white silk up to her knees. The dress she had obsessed over for months, the dress that was supposed to represent her perfect new life, was now nothing but a heavy, suffocating trap dragging her down. She bounded down the remaining marble stairs, ignoring the gasps of the guests as she pushed aggressively past them. She chased after Blake, who had suddenly turned, and followed his parents down the narrow service hallway. Her satin heels slipped terribly on the polished floor, but she kept running, her breath catching in her throat. She burst through the heavy metal service doors and stumbled out into the warm afternoon sun. She found herself standing in the dusty gravel of the vendor parking lot, the exact same hidden lot where she had specifically ordered her father to hide his rusted truck. Blake was standing a few yards away next to a sleek black luxury sedan, furiously pressing the button on his key fob. His parents were already sitting in the back seat, hiding their faces behind the dark-tinted glass, abandoning any pretense of dignity. Natalie ran toward him, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe inside the tight, structured corset of her expensive gown. She grabbed his arm, crying out his name, her voice cracking with raw emotion. She begged him to explain what was happening and pleaded with him to go back inside and fix the terrible misunderstanding with the venue manager. She told him the guests were watching and the ceremony was supposed to start in less than an hour. Blake ripped his arm away from her grasp with a sudden violent force that nearly knocked her off balance. He turned to face her, and the charming, sophisticated man she had loved vanished. There was no warmth left in his eyes and no comfort in his voice. His face was twisted into a cruel, ugly sneer. He looked at her tear-stained face and her perfect white dress with total revulsion. He demanded to know how she expected him to fix a financial crisis that her pathetic family had caused. He raised his voice, shouting that this entire disaster was her fault, because she could not even get her cheap, useless father to write a simple check. He screamed that she was supposed to handle her side of the family, and that her father's stubborn refusal to pay the venue balance had ruined his reputation forever. He took a step closer, towering over her as the distant high-pitched wail of police sirens began to echo down the canyon road. He told her she was worthless to him if she could not provide the financial support they needed to maintain their lifestyle. He spat the words out like toxic venom, telling her he only proposed because he assumed a lonely blue-collar mechanic would empty his entire life savings just to see his daughter marry into a respectable family. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that sent shivers down her spine. He said he never actually loved her. He admitted that she was just an easy mark, a naive, gullible girl who was so desperate to climb the social ladder that she would believe any lie he told her. He confessed that they needed her pristine credit score and her steady income to keep their fraudulent lives afloat, and since she had failed to deliver the final payment, she was of no use to them anymore. Blake turned around and climbed quickly into the driver's seat of the leased sedan. He slammed the heavy door shut, leaving Natalie standing alone in a cloud of swirling dust as the tires spun out aggressively on the loose gravel. The luxury car sped down the narrow service road, desperately trying to escape before the police cruisers blocked the main security gates. The bright red taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the fading rumble of the engine. and the growing sound of approaching sirens. Natalie fell to her knees right there in the dirt. The sharp stones bit deeply into her legs, tearing the delicate, expensive lace of her $10,000 gown. She did not care about the beautiful venue or the imported white orchids or the wealthy guests standing shocked inside the lobby. She cared about the thick cotton letter she had left upstairs in the bridal suite. The words her father had meticulously written echoed in her mind with terrifying, undeniable clarity. He had warned her. He had explicitly told her that she was marrying into a sinking ship. He had told her that she was trading her personal integrity for a family of ruthless con artists. She looked down at her hands resting against the dry dirt. She thought about her father's hands, permanently stained with grease and oil from decades of hard, honest work. She remembered how those rough, strong hands had held her when she was a little girl, keeping her safe and warm against the world. She remembered how he had quietly absorbed every insult she had hurled at him over the past year. He had endured her immense disrespect, her 30 humiliating rules, and her endless selfish demands without ever raising his voice. He had loved her enough to let her make her own terrible choices, and he had loved her enough to let her face the brutal consequences of her own arrogance. 2 black and white police cruisers pulled swiftly into the service lot, their bright red and blue lights flashing intensely against the white exterior walls of the grand estate. Uniformed officers stepped quickly out of the vehicles asking her if she was all right, and demanding to know in which direction the Evans family had fled. Natalie stayed on her knees, crying heavy, breathless tears of pure regret. She realized in that exact moment that she had thrown away the only man in the entire world who had ever truly loved her unconditionally. She had discarded a devoted, honest father who possessed genuine, immense wealth to chase after a shallow, toxic, and fabricated illusion. The fake fairy tale was permanently over, and the harsh, unforgiving reality of her choices had finally arrived to collect its debt. The warm breeze off the Pacific Ocean swept across the expansive private balcony of my resort suite. I stood near the glass railing, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with ice water and a slice of lime. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of tangerine and crushed violet. My smartphone was resting on the small teak table beside me. It had finally stopped vibrating with the frantic notifications of the venue crisis. Then the screen illuminated one more time. The name Natalie flashed across the glass. I watched it ring for several seconds. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that connection. I knew she was standing in the wreckage of her manufactured fairy tale. I reached out and picked up the device, pressing the green button to accept the call. The moment the line connected, chaos spilled through the speaker. I could hear venue staff gasping and police questions in the distance. Over it all, Natalie was sobbing. She told me she was sitting in the vendor lot with her $10,000 dress torn and Blake gone. The venue had shut down the event and was documenting the unpaid balance cancellation costs and the disturbance. She begged me to call my manager, waive whatever fees could still be waived, and wire the $80,000 so the vendors and guests would stop treating the day like a public disaster. She promised she would repay me if I just made the humiliation end. I listened to her desperate words while looking out at the endless blue ocean. A few months ago, hearing that level of sheer terror in her voice would have triggered an automatic response. I would have dropped everything, emptied my bank accounts, and rushed blindly to her rescue. I would have sacrificed my own dignity to ensure she never had to face a single moment of discomfort. But the man who used to do those things was gone. He had been slowly suffocated by her constant condescension and finally buried under the weight of her 30 humiliating wedding rules. I felt a heavy sorrow for the hard lesson she was currently enduring, but I knew with certainty that stepping in now would only destroy the necessary work of this crisis. When she finally stopped talking to catch her breath, the silence stretched across the miles between us. I did not raise my voice. I told her I still had the list of 30 rules and read the second part of rule number 12 exactly as she had written it. Do not ask the Evans family or the venue staff for handouts or special treatment, because we are functioning as independent, successful adults. I let the words hang there. Wiring $80,000 to cover a wedding none of them could afford would be a handout. Ordering my manager to ignore the contract because she was my daughter would be special treatment. I told her I was simply honoring the standards she had demanded from me. She let out a loud, broken gasp. She begged me to stop quoting the list. She admitted that she had been arrogant and foolish. She confessed that Blake had pressured her into writing those rules to keep me hidden away because they were ashamed of my blue-collar background. She cried that Blake had abandoned her in the dirt parking lot and driven away with his parents, leaving her to face the angry vendors and the police alone. Her voice dropped into a desperate, frantic whisper as she told me the terrible things he had said before he sped away. She told me Blake had screamed in her face and blamed her for having a cheap, useless father. She said Blake had explicitly told her she was worthless to his family if she could not provide the financial support they needed to maintain their high society lifestyle. She repeated his cruel words, hoping they would spark my anger. She was trying to trigger my protective instincts, hoping I would wire the $80,000 just to prove Blake wrong and demonstrate my immense wealth to the people who had insulted me. I saw right through the manipulation. I took a slow sip of my ice water and leaned against the balcony railing. I told her I was not enjoying her pain, but I was also not going to intervene to stop it. I told her that wiring the money to the venue would not prove Blake wrong at all. I explained that paying the bill would actually prove him right. It would confirm that she was nothing more than a convenient pipeline to my bank account. It would show them that they could abuse her and insult me and still walk away with exactly what they wanted. I told her I refused to validate their parasitic behavior. I told her that for her entire adult life, I had shielded her from the consequences of her actions. I explained that she had chosen to trade a father who loved her unconditionally for a family of parasites who only valued her credit score. I told her she had chased the illusion of extreme wealth so blindly that she willingly threw away her own integrity. I said she had demanded total independence from me, and I was finally giving it to her. I told her this humiliation and this financial crisis were not punishments. They were simply the strict, undeniable cost of the freedom she had asked for. I told her she was a capable adult, and she would have to figure out how to clean up this mess on her own. She started to scream my name, begging me not to hang up the phone. She promised she would do whatever I wanted if I just came back and fixed it. I told her I loved her very much, and that was exactly why I was not coming back to save her. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I could still hear her small, frantic voice pleading through the speaker. I tapped the red button on the screen, severing the connection completely. I placed the silent device face down on the teak table. The desperate noise of her ruined wedding vanished, replaced instantly by the rhythmic, soothing sound of the Hawaiian waves crashing gently against the sandy shore below. The plea had been rejected, and the cord was permanently cut. I left the phone resting face down on the small teak table and walked back into the quiet, air-conditioned comfort of my resort suite. The heavy silence of the room was a stark contrast to the frantic screaming I had just severed. I walked over to my open leather suitcase resting on the luggage rack. From a soft, protective velvet pouch tucked carefully inside the side pocket, I pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden vial. It was smooth and warm against my palm. It held a small portion of my beautiful Diane's ashes. I had kept this vial securely locked in a safe for the past 5 years, waiting for the exact right moment to fulfill the promise we made to each other so long ago. We had sworn we would see this ocean together. I held the wooden vial tightly in my rough hands, feeling the certainty that the moment had finally arrived. I left the suite and made my way down through the lush, winding pathways of the resort grounds. The paved walkways eventually gave way to soft, pristine white sand. I slipped off my leather sandals and left them near the edge of the path, letting my bare feet sink into the warm ground. The late afternoon sun was beginning its final glorious descent, hovering just above the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The tropical breeze carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and blooming hibiscus flowers. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shoreline created a steady, calming heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with my own. I walked slowly toward the waterline, letting the cool, foaming tide wash over my ankles. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the ocean was deeply humbling, making the petty manufactured dramas of high society feel insignificant. I stood there as the water receded, pulling the sand away from beneath my heels. I uncapped the small wooden vial. I simply spoke to Diane in the quiet, familiar way we had spoken to each other every night for decades. I told her we finally made it to the island. I told her about the warmth of the sun and the incredible beauty of the horizon. I told her I was sorry it took me so long to get here, but I had to make sure our daughter was fully prepared to face the real world. I told her I loved her more than life itself, and that her spirit had been the guiding force that helped me survive the loneliness of the past 5 years. I tipped the vial forward and let the fine gray ashes spill out into the gentle outgoing tide. The water caught the ashes, instantly carrying them out into the brilliant reflection of the setting sun. I watched until every last trace disappeared into the vast, beautiful ocean. At that exact moment, an invisible weight lifted off my shoulders. The years of quiet mourning, the months of absorbing insults from the Evans family, the agonizing days of watching Natalie turn into a stranger, it all washed away with the tide. I was no longer holding on to the past, and I was no longer trying to manage the future. I was simply existing in the present. I stayed by the water's edge for a long time, watching the sky slowly darken into deep twilight purple. As I turned to walk back along the shoreline, I noticed a man standing a few yards away near an outcropping of dark volcanic rocks. I was an older local man, with deeply tanned skin and silver hair pulled back into a simple knot. He was packing up a heavy woven fishing net and arranging a row of simple wooden tackle boxes. He moved with the slow, deliberate efficiency of someone who had spent his entire life working alongside the unpredictable rhythm of the sea. As I approached, he looked up and offered a warm, easy smile. He just offered a simple, genuine greeting, commenting on the spectacular colors of the fading sunset. I returned the smile and stopped to admire the heavy, beautifully crafted fishing net he was folding. I told him it looked like a piece of equipment that required an immense amount of patience to master. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that felt authentic, and told me it was a net he had woven himself over many long, quiet evenings. He explained how the knots had to be tied to withstand the brutal pull of the ocean currents. We stood there by the crashing waves, talking effortlessly about the water, the weather, and the simple, pure mechanics of building things that are meant to last. There was no posturing in his voice and no hidden agenda in his words. As I reached out to help him lift one of the heavy wooden tackle boxes, his eyes dropped down to my hands. He paused for a moment, looking closely at the thick calluses, the deep permanent scars, and the knuckles that had been broken and healed a dozen times over during my years building a heavy machinery empire. These were the exact same hands that my daughter had looked at with disgust. These were the hands that Blake Evans had mocked, calling me a tired old mechanic. These were the hands I had been instructed to hide away at table 14. The fisherman looked back up into my eyes, and his expression shifted into one of quiet respect. He nodded slowly and told me those were the hands of a man who knew the true, honest meaning of a hard day's work. He said, "You cannot buy hands like that in a luxury store, and you certainly cannot fake them to impress a crowd. You only earn them by giving your blood and your sweat to something you truly believe in." He told me that any man who carried those marks carried a wealth that could never be taken away. It was not the patronizing fake politeness of wealthy socialites pretending to care about the working class. It was the genuine, undeniable respect between two men who understood the honest, brutal reality of manual labor. I smiled, looking down at my own hands and feeling a deep, incredible warmth bloom in my chest. I told him I had spent 40 years building a life with these hands, and that he was right. They were the most valuable thing I owned. We shook hands, a firm, solid grip that communicated 1,000 shared values without needing another single word. I left the fisherman by the rocks and continued my walk back up the beach toward the glowing lights of the resort. I thought about the stark contrast between the interaction I just had and the miserable rehearsal dinner from the night before. I realized that true wealth is not measured by the balances hidden in offshore accounts or the names printed on luxury labels. True wealth is the ability to stand comfortably in your own skin. It is the peace of knowing you built your life with integrity. It is the freedom to look a stranger in the eye and connect with them based on mutual respect rather than calculated financial leverage. The toxic weight of my daughter's endless expectations was gone. The desperate need to shrink myself to protect her fragile manufactured image had vanished into the ocean breeze. I was no longer a burden to be hidden away or a wallet to be drained. I was just Leo Campbell, a man who worked hard, loved his wife deeply, and possessed the quiet strength to walk away from anyone who demanded he compromise his soul. I walked up the illuminated path toward my suite, feeling a deep, resonating joy. I was unburdened, at peace and free. 3 weeks had passed since the afternoon I scattered Diane's ashes into the Pacific Ocean. I extended my stay at the resort, indefinitely moving from the luxury suite into a quiet, private bungalow nestled near the edge of a lush tropical garden. The chaotic noise of the city and the suffocating pressure of my daughters. Expectations felt like a distant, fading memory. I fell into a simple, peaceful routine. I woke up every morning before the sun crested the horizon. I walked down to the beach, breathing in the warm, salt air, and watched the local fishermen cast their nets into the crystal-clear water. I drank my black coffee on the wooden lanai, listening to the tropical birds singing in the palm trees. For the first time in my entire adult life, I had nothing to fix and no one to rescue. I was simply living. My phone rarely rang anymore. The frantic barrage of messages from my daughter had slowed to a complete halt a few days after the wedding disaster. I knew she was dealing with the brutal aftermath of her choices, and I knew she was finally too ashamed to keep demanding my help. But on a calm Tuesday morning, while I was watching the ocean waves crash against the black volcanic rocks, my phone vibrated softly on the small glass table. The caller identification displayed the name of my wealth manager. I picked up the device and answered, knowing that Owen Foster was calling to deliver his final report on the collapse of the Evans family. Owen spoke with his usual calm, professional cadence. He told me he had kept a close eye on the fallout, just as I had instructed, ensuring that none of the financial shrapnel managed to strike my own private equity portfolio. He said the dust had finally settled, and the landscape back home was unrecognizable. I sat back in my wicker chair and listened to the destruction of a fake high society empire. Owen started with Blake and his parents. The venue had remained closed, and the wedding was canceled. By the time local police arrived, the Evans family had already driven away from the service lot, but officers documented the disturbance payment dispute and statements from venue staff. Guests had recorded the public collapse on their phones, and those videos spread quickly through the social circles the Evans family valued. Their creditors were already dealing with late payments and heavy balances, and the spectacle ended whatever patience remained. Leasing companies repossessed vehicles in default, collection notices multiplied, and their house moved closer to foreclosure. The image of effortless wealth could no longer survive the paperwork behind it. Then Owen moved on to Blake. The man who had mocked my calloused hands was facing legal claims from vendors and the obligations attached to contracts he had signed for a wedding he could not fund. His credit was exhausted, and the public collapse made it harder to keep selling the image that had sustained him. When the pressure became too great, Blake did exactly what parasites do when the host runs dry. He packed his bags, abandoned his parents and Natalie, and fled the state, severing contact, rather than staying, to deal with the debts and legal notices gathering around him. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as Owen shifted his report to the fate of my daughter. My heart braced itself for the heavy, painful truth. Owen told me that when Blake vanished, He left Natalie holding the remnants of their shattered life. Because Natalie was blinded by her desire to fit into his world, she had made several terrible financial decisions in the weeks leading up to the wedding. She had co-signed on multiple high-interest loans to cover the lavish floral arrangements, the custom invitations, and the expensive designer gown. She had put her own name on the lease for their luxury downtown apartment because Blake's credit was secretly ruined. When Blake disappeared, he left her legally responsible for the entire mountain of debt they had accumulated together. Owen painted a stark picture of Natalie's new reality. He said she was forced to break the lease on the luxury apartment, immediately surrendering her security deposit to avoid a lawsuit. She sold her designer clothes, her expensive handbags, and her engagement ring just to cover the immediate penalties. She had moved out of the upscale city center and rented a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a much older, less desirable neighborhood. Owen told me she was currently taking the bus to work because she could no longer afford the payments on her leased luxury sedan. Owen explained that Natalie had begged her corporate employer for extra hours and had taken a second job working nights and weekends at a local restaurant. The young woman who had sent me 30 humiliating rules demanding I hide my blue-collar background was now wearing a uniform and waiting tables just to keep her head above water. She was working 14-hour days, dealing with rude customers and scrubbing tables simply to pay down the debt left behind by the man she thought was her high society prince. She was exhausted, physically drained, and alone. Owen finished his report and waited quietly on the line. He asked me if I wanted him to intervene. He reminded me that a single small transfer from my accounts could instantly wipe out her debt and pull her out of that tiny studio apartment. He offered to set up a blind trust so she would not even know the money came from me. The temptation to protect my child surged in my chest with an intense, familiar ache. For 28 years, my natural instinct had been to shield her from the harsh edges of the world. It physically hurt to picture my daughter riding a city bus, late at night, exhausted and heartbroken. But I looked out at the vast, powerful ocean and remembered the cold, arrogant look in her eyes when she pulled me into the hallway at the rehearsal dinner. I remembered how she had prioritized the fake prestige of the Evans family over the genuine, unconditional love of her own father. I remembered the $15,000 check I wrote for her white orchids and how she took it without an ounce of gratitude. I knew that if I sent Owen to rescue her now, I would be robbing her of the most important education she would ever receive. I would be teaching her that her actions still had no permanent consequences. I took a slow, deep breath and told Owen to close the file. I thanked him for his thorough work and instructed him to leave her exactly where she was. I told him I was not going to wire her a single dime. I ended the call and set the phone down on the glass table. I watched the local fisherman pulling his heavy net out of the water down on the beach. I thought about the blisters on my own hands and the decades of grueling labor it took to build my life. Natalie was finally learning the true value of $1. She was learning the heavy, crushing weight of debt and the bitter sting of betrayal. She was learning that the shiny, polished exterior of high society is often a fragile mask hiding moral bankruptcy. She was learning that hard work is not something to be hidden in a dirt parking lot, but something that builds character, resilience, and genuine survival. It was a brutal, agonizing lesson, but it was the only way she would ever truly grow up. She was finally walking through the fire that would burn away her arrogance and forge her into an honest, independent woman. I felt a deep, quiet sorrow for her pain, but I also felt a solid, unwavering confidence in my decision. I was no longer the foolish old man she could push into the shadows. I was a father who loved his daughter enough to let her fall so she could finally learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. The storm had passed, the wreckage was settling, and the quiet, beautiful peace of the island was all that remained. The weeks turned into a quiet, beautiful routine on the island. I spent my days walking the shoreline and my evenings watching the sun dip below the vast, endless horizon. The heavy, thick humidity of the tropical air felt like a warm blanket wrapping around my tired bones. I thought often about the house back on the mainland. It was a sturdy two-story brick house sitting on a quiet suburban street. It was the house where Diane and I had painted the nursery walls a soft, pale yellow. It was the house where I had spent countless weekends lying on the cold concrete garage floor covered in dark motor oil, maintaining an old truck to keep up the appearance of a struggling pensioner. For years, that house had been my absolute sanctuary. But the more I sat under the shade of the banyan trees, the more I realized that the house had slowly transformed into a museum. It was a museum filled with the ghosts of a life that no longer existed, and a daughter who had chosen to walk away from the values we had tried so desperately to teach her. I realized that returning to that house would mean returning to the shadow of the man I used to be. It would mean walking back into the kitchen where I had printed out those 30 humiliating rules. It would mean looking out the window at the driveway where Natalie had looked at my grease-stained hands with profound, undeniable disgust. I did not want to live inside those memories anymore. I did not want to sleep in a house that felt hollow and heavy with the toxic weight of her crushing expectations. I had shed the fake skin of the helpless blue-collar mechanic, and I had absolutely no desire to ever put it back on. I picked up my smartphone and made one final operational call to Owen Foster. I told him my vacation was no longer temporary and instructed him to put the suburban house on the market through a reputable broker. I did not care about squeezing out the highest possible price. I wanted the chapter closed cleanly. I asked for a careful moving service to pack Diane's books, photographs, and personal keepsakes and ship them to me. The remaining furniture and the old Silverado could be sold or stored through ordinary channels. There was no need to create one more sentimental obligation on the mainland. Owen listened quietly to my instructions, taking precise notes just as he always did. He did not ask if I was sure or try to talk me out of the decision. He simply told me he would handle every single detail with his usual absolute discretion. He told me it had been an honor to watch me handle this transition, and he wished me nothing but the deepest peace on the island. I thanked him for his loyalty and his flawless execution of the venue trap. I ended the call knowing that my last remaining physical anchor to the mainland had been entirely severed. The bridge was burned, but I was standing on the right side of the water. With the past officially packed away in boxes, I turned my complete attention to the future. I did not want to live in the busy resort forever. I wanted a space that belonged entirely to me. I contacted a local property agent and gave her my exact specifications. I did not ask to see sprawling massive mega mansions or flashy glass penthouses located in the middle of busy tourist districts. I asked for privacy craftsmanship and an uninterrupted connection to the natural landscape. Within 3 days, she drove me up a winding dirt road to a secluded piece of land sitting high above a quiet, hidden cove. The property was absolutely breathtaking. It was a modest but incredibly well-built timber frame house constructed from rich, dark local wood that smelled of cedar and salt. It sat on 2 acres of lush green land surrounded by vibrant flowering hibiscus bushes and towering coconut palms. The back of the house featured a wide open wooden lanai that stretched out toward the cliff, offering a staggering panoramic view of the deep blue Pacific Ocean. It was not a house built to impress wealthy socialites or host lavish corporate dinner parties. It was a home built for a man who valued peace, quiet, and absolute integrity. I bought it that very same afternoon, paying the full asking price in cash, directly from my private equity portfolio. Moving into the timber house felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for 5 years. When the boxes of Diane's belongings finally arrived from the mainland, I spent an entire weekend carefully placing her items around the new rooms. I set her favorite framed pictures on the solid wooden shelves. I placed her books on the nightstand. The house felt warm and lived in immediately. It felt like a true home. I was no longer hiding my wealth, but I was also not flaunting it. I hired local contractors to build a small wood shop in the back near the garden. I bought a set of high-quality hand tools and beautiful pieces of raw mahogany. I started working with my hands again, not out of grueling necessity, or to maintain a fake blue-collar disguise, but simply because I genuinely loved the honest, quiet focus of building things from scratch. I thought about Natalie from time to time. The anger and the sharp, stinging betrayal had completely washed away, leaving a soft, dull ache of acceptance. I knew she was currently riding city buses and working double shifts at a restaurant to pay off the massive, crushing debt that Blake had abandoned her with. I knew she was exhausted and humbled, but I also knew she was finally building real character. She was learning that nobody was coming to magically rescue her. She was learning that she had to rely on her own two hands to survive the mess she had created. I hoped that one day the fire of her current struggle would forge her into a stronger, kinder, and more authentic woman. But I also accepted that her journey was entirely her own. I was no longer her financial safety net, and I was no longer the silent victim of her arrogance. I had stepped completely off the stage of her manufactured drama. It was a bright, beautiful Tuesday morning. The tropical birds were singing loudly in the palm trees outside my open bedroom window. I woke up feeling a deep, resonating energy in my bones. I walked into my beautiful open-concept kitchen and filled the glass carafe with fresh local coffee grounds. The rich, earthy aroma filled the warm air. I poured the dark, steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked slowly out the sliding glass doors onto the wide wooden lanai. The sun was just beginning to climb over the eastern horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the endless, moving water. The waves crashed rhythmically against the black volcanic rocks below, sending up a fine, cool mist that settled gently against my skin. I sat down in a comfortable woven chair and rested my hands on the smooth wooden armrests. I looked down at my hands, running my thumb over the thick, familiar calluses and the faded scars. They were the hands of a man who had built an empire from the dirt up. They were the hands of a devoted husband who had cared for his wife until her very last breath. And they were the hands of a father who had finally loved his daughter enough to walk away. I took a slow, deep sip of the hot black coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle into my chest. I listened to the wind rustling through the broad green leaves of the garden. There were no cell phones ringing. There were no humiliating rules to follow. There were no arrogant fake millionaires demanding my submission. There was only the vast, beautiful ocean and the absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. I had not won by shouting or fighting or dragging myself down into the toxic mud of their endless deception. I had won by simply recognizing my own true worth and quietly walking away. I closed my eyes and smiled into the morning sun, feeling completely, perfectly, and undeniably victorious. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true wealth is never defined by the clothes we wear or the cars we drive, but by the quiet integrity of how we build our lives. We often make the mistake of shrinking ourselves to fit into the lives of people who do not value us simply because they happen to be family. But unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance for blatant disrespect. Sometimes the most profound act of love a parent can offer is allowing a child to face the harsh, unforgiving consequences of their own arrogance. By walking away from a highly toxic dynamic, you are not losing a battle, but rather reclaiming your personal peace and your fundamental dignity. Respect is not something that can be bought with a maxed-out credit card or demanded through a list of humiliating rules. It must be earned through pure honesty, and when that respect is entirely absent, the most powerful response is simply to leave the table. If you found value in this story about reclaiming your dignity, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel.